it's really great to hear from Murat at the beginning there, because it really brings home to us how vital this issue is of ownership, not just to us in the UK, and I think we've learned over the last year particularly it's reinforced why this is such a vital issue, but also internationally, and we're all following really closely what's going on in Turkey and working with our colleagues, our sister unions there, to look out for journalists who are working under incredibly difficult conditions. It's not just Turkey, it's also in Greece. Last week the screens went dark in Greece when the government pulled the plug on ERT, the public service broadcaster, without any consultation whatsoever. And this is at a time when the people of Greece need independent, impartial reporting on the hardship caused by the austerity measures, the highest youth unemployment in Europe, and the advance of the far right. So ERT's closure was an attack not just on news, but also of democracy. And it shows that whether the power is being wielded by the state or a multinational corporation, media freedom can hang on a very thin thread indeed. Today's Guardian revealed how the UK spied on its G20 allies at London summits, which might be quite embarrassing for David Cameron and for the spooks, but it's exactly what the press should be doing, keeping governments to account and guarding our civil liberties. And a free media is essential to democracy. It just doesn't work without it. People need to hear a range of arguments, they need equal access to information and opinion if they're to be able to be participative in local and national democracy. And evidence shows repeatedly that countries with a large number of newspapers and an independent media are less susceptible to corruption by politicians and business. So that's why the question of who owns the press is so vital. And the NUJ was a core participant at the Leveson inquiry, and this investigation into the culture and practices of the press really lifted the lid on how widespread unethical and illegal activities had been in the industry. It also demonstrated how the relationship between politicians, the press and the police was corrupted by the fact of, in the instance of one man, Rupert Murdoch, owning 37% of the newspaper market. And with that power comes arrogance amongst his own newspaper executives, who really genuinely seemed to believe that they had become untouchable. And it was really interesting to see politicians kind of turn up at Leveson and kind of unburden themselves, and by their own admission, many admitted that they'd been simply too craven to take on the Murdoch press. They feared that they'd be pursued personally, or that their party's policies would be savaged. And Prime Minister after Prime Minister felt that they had to pay homage at the court of Rupert. They meet up in Mayfair clubs with promises of being backed by the Murdoch press at the next election. One of them even became godfather to the godfather of the press's own daughter. Likewise, within the police, particularly the Metropolitan Police, an unhealthy relationship developed between officers and News International papers. And Rupert Murdoch has very long kind of maintained that he doesn't dictate any editorial line in his newspapers. And I'd ask just one question: if that's really the case, then why did all but one of his 175 newspapers around the world have the same pro-war line on Iraq? John Major was told by the media mogul that he'd withdraw the support of his newspapers unless his government changed its policy on the UK's membership of the EU. This is the kind of practical way in which the power of one man influenced the decisions of our press here in the UK. And it's been quite a bumpy ride, as Des referred to, during the Leveson inquiry. And post-Leveson, the national newspaper groups have shown, without doubt, that they have absolutely no intention of having their power checked. Those who signed up to Pressbuff's alternative, the industry's alternative to the cross-party Royal Charter on press regulation, absolutely want to exclude journalists, and they want to exclude you, the public, from the process. If they have their way, they absolutely intend to keep control with the owners and with the publishers, and their plans do not include a free or impartial arbitrator. That's despite Leveson clearly showing their failure to run a responsible press which offers redress for those who are traduced in their pages. And I'd ask, do those plans from the industry pass the $1 million test? And I really don't think that they do. And during the past 2 decades, all we've seen is the same old story. Media law in the UK has been about deregulation and about attempts to limit and any attempts rather to limit media power have just been dismissed out of hand. The imperative has always been to open up markets and to promote light touch regulation, and the result has been a landscape that's been typified as one of merger, takeover and agglomeration of major media groups. So the result of that is that the local and regional press in the UK is run by a handful of owners who are more interested in milking huge profits than in promoting quality journalism. Cuts after cuts in the newsroom mean council meetings and court cases are just not being covered. What used to be and what should be bread and butter functions of any local newspaper. Tesco can put its stores wherever it wants because the local newspaper often just doesn't have the resources to campaign for its readers' interests. And that's why the NUJ has called for a review on local press. We've asked for tax incentives, industry levies, and new models of ownership to keep local news alive because it matters so much in any local community. We can't have the likes of David Montgomery taking control of the future and the destination of our local press industry. This is the man who thinks that journalists should be harvesters of content. And by that he means just simply pouring press releases into preset grids on a page and using pictures of readers' cats instead of employing professional photographers. And today's media is moving so quickly that the one legislated for in the 2003 Communications Act, today's media is a very different climate altogether. Modern technology has radically changed the way the world has access to news and information, and in theory, the greater the source of news and the wider the plurality of media, the better it is. But cross-ownership between news organisations, online services, networks and mobile phone companies can often confuse the consumer. It can fool them into thinking that a news service is neutral because the capacity to create bundles with deals with a phone company or your online publisher or social networks gives media organisations the opportunity for a far greater reach across a variety of different platforms. And it becomes much more difficult for the consumer to disentangle the connections and the influence and to know who's actually owning what. And it's the same news organisations which dominate news on the internet. So that's why the NUJ believes the time has way come to put forward caps and checks to safeguard the freedom of the press. It's our policy to call for the maximum market share to be set at 25% across all platforms. We believe that any market share that reaches or has the potential to reach 15% should also be subject to a public interest test. We should be able to discuss it, debate it and make a decision. Private firms will be required to divest so that their shares don't exceed 25%. Or relevant holdings could be organised as public trusts or other publicly governed and accountable structures following a public interest test, review and agreement. All of these things are possible. Other organisations have put their caps at slightly different percentage figures, which is fine. Media Analysis, Enders Analysis, has proposed a 15% cross-media limit. That would include any medium of communication that stands between a creator of content and the audience. Joran Leveson, Labour suggested 30% of the newspaper market could be the limit. And as we just heard before, Harriet Harman last week suggested that all of these should be the starting point for a discussion, which I think is a very positive step in the right direction. Critically, she also mentioned and called for a robust fit and proper person test to be introduced under a fresh push for curbs on the industry. And speaking as somebody who spent their journalistic days working for Richard Desmond at Express newspapers, it's a shame Labour didn't have come to that decision in the past, but I think it would be a very positive move now if that notion was agreed and we could campaign towards that. Because now is really the time for the nettle to be grasped. There's no more taking the easy path or bottling it in the face of the bile and the invective that the industry owners and their editors will inevitably throw. We've seen what they can do when they're rattled and they feel like their back's up against the wall over the course of the last year. And the stalling by the national press after Leveson and the hysterical responses of the likes of Associated Newspapers or The Telegraph shows that the industry cannot be trusted and we cannot rely on an unfettered market, because a genuinely free press would be precious, and we need a lot of change if we're to get there, because it should absolutely be our press and our media and definitely not theirs. Thank you.